In the heart of a quiet, almost forgotten village, there stood a modest tavern run by two brothers, Elias and Henry. It had been a fixture in the community for generations, its creaky wooden sign swaying gently in the wind, announcing to travelers that they had arrived at a place of warmth and comfort. The tavern's fire crackled merrily in the hearth, the rich scent of roasted meats and freshly baked bread wafting through the air. The brothers were known for their warm hospitality, welcoming anyone who passed through the village with open arms. It was the kind of place where you could sit for hours, share stories with strangers, and forget about the world outside. Yet, there was an odd quality to the tavern. Something about it made guests uneasy, though they couldn't put their finger on why. The brothers, Elias and Henry, appeared to be the epitome of kindness. They were always there to refill your glass, ask about your journey, and offer advice about the local area. Their smiles never seemed to waver, their hospitality never ceased, and they made every guest feel like they were the most important person in the room. The whiskey they served was the finest anyone had ever tasted, and the meals were hearty and satisfying. Travelers from far and wide came to enjoy the warmth of the tavern, leaving behind stories of their stays. Yet beneath the surface of their graciousness, something felt wrong. Guests who stayed too long started to notice strange occurrences, whispers when no one was speaking, flickering candle flames casting shadows in unusual places, and the unsettling sensation of being watched. As the evening wore on, the tavern's charm began to feel more like a carefully constructed facade. A couple of guests, having stayed for several days, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the brothers' overbearing attention. One evening, a traveler named Robert, who had been enjoying his whiskey by the fire, noticed Henry standing too close for comfort, his gaze lingering a little too long. When Robert turned to speak to Elias, he found the same intense stare directed at him. It was as if the brothers were sizing him up, watching every move he made. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was simply his imagination, but as the night went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. The brothers, though outwardly pleasant, seemed to have a strange way of making everyone around them feel like prey. The following night, the sounds began. Unexplained creaks echoed from the darkened corners of the tavern, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. A guest, lying in bed on the second floor, swore they heard faint whispering voices coming from the hallway, though no one was there. A chill swept through the room, and the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker unnaturally. By morning, the guests had all but forgotten the strange events, dismissing them as the result of too much drink or a mind playing tricks. But something lingered in the air, an unspoken tension that no one dared to acknowledge. The brothers, as always, were unbothered, continuing their duties with the same calm demeanor, as though nothing had happened at all. It was becoming clear that the longer one stayed at the tavern, the more difficult it became to ignore the oddities that seemed to accumulate. A growing unease settled over the tavern, like a thick fog that no one could escape. The brothers were still as hospitable as ever, but their smiles now seemed colder, their actions more deliberate. A few guests who had planned to leave early found their belongings mysteriously moved, their exits subtly blocked by the brothers' insistence on one more drink or a quick chat. They tried to make their exit, but something kept pulling them back. The longer they stayed, the more they began to notice the little things, the strange, lingering glances, the way the brothers would appear at just the right moment, and the way the tavern seemed to hold them in a grip they couldn't explain. What had once seemed like a warm, welcoming inn had slowly begun to feel like a trap. The atmosphere, though still pleasant on the surface, had shifted into something darker and more unsettling. The brothers' hospitality, it seemed, had an agenda of its own. On a crisp autumn evening, a lone traveler named Thomas arrived at the tavern, his face weary from a long journey. He had heard of the brothers' hospitality and was eager to find rest before continuing on his way. Elias and Henry welcomed him with their usual warmth, offering him a comfortable seat by the fire and a generous glass of their finest whiskey. Thomas was a quiet man, but he appreciated the kindness. Feeling safe in the brothers' company, he retired to his room later that night, a sense of peace settling over him. But as dawn broke the next day, the atmosphere shifted. Thomas was gone. His room was undisturbed, his belongings still neatly arranged, the bed perfectly made. No sign of struggle, no trace of where he had gone. The tavern was eerily quiet, and the brothers, ever the picture of composure, seemed unfazed. When the villagers learned of the disappearance, they immediately grew concerned. The local constable arrived, hoping to investigate, but Elias and Henry were calm, almost too calm, as they explained they had no idea where Thomas had gone. The brothers had seen nothing unusual, heard nothing suspicious. They offered their full cooperation, allowing the constable to search the tavern and surrounding grounds. But there was no evidence, no clues to point to anything out of the ordinary. The police were stumped, and after hours of investigation, the case was closed. The villagers, though disturbed, had no choice but to accept the situation as a strange, unexplainable event. The brothers returned to their duties, as if nothing had happened, serving drinks to the remaining guests with the same practiced cheerfulness. As the days passed, whispers began to spread among the travelers who had stayed at the tavern in the past. A few claimed they had seen Thomas the night before his disappearance, acting strangely. He had been muttering under his breath about the brothers' offer, and his eyes had seemed distant, like he was lost in thought, or worse, in a trance. These reports were inconsistent, with some guests recalling him pacing restlessly in the corner, others claiming to have heard him speaking to the brothers in low, hushed tones, but no one had thought to intervene. The unsettling rumors spread like wildfire among the village's travelers, though most dared not speak of it openly, unsure of what to make of it. Despite the growing unease, the tavern continued to operate as usual. Elias and Henry showed no outward signs of concern or guilt. They greeted each new guest with the same warmth, offering their hospitality without hesitation. The brothers seemed completely unaffected by the incident, their lives unchanged. Some guests, however, began to feel a strange discomfort when they entered the tavern. The place felt the same, yet there was an undeniable shift in the air. Something was wrong. The laughter around the fire seemed hollow, and the crackling of the logs in the hearth sounded too loud, almost like an uncomfortable reminder of what had happened. Over time, those who had stayed at the tavern began to piece together the fragments of the whispers. A few mentioned that Thomas had seemed deeply unsettled during his stay, as though he was aware of something lurking beneath the surface. There were even some who claimed to have seen him talking to the brothers in a secretive manner, as if they had been preparing him for something. The memories were fragmented and unclear, but one thing was certain. The disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed, yet no one could prove anything, and the brothers were careful to deflect any direct questions. The villagers, though unsettled, continued to visit the tavern, too accustomed to the brothers' hospitality to question it further. Still, the thought lingered. Was something darker at play here? The months following Thomas's disappearance saw the tavern's reputation grow even further, despite the chilling events that had unfolded. New travelers came and went, often unaware of the dark undertones that had begun to haunt the place. But those who had stayed before, those who had whispered about Thomas, felt the growing tension, and many began to avoid the tavern altogether. For those who did stay, the brothers' eerie charm was undeniable. Elias and Henry were kind, attentive, and constantly watching, as if nothing could go wrong under their care. But as more travelers came through, the feeling of unease deepened, like something malevolent was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next guest to disappear. The unsettling truth was becoming clearer. The brothers' hospitality was part of something much more sinister. As the months passed, more travelers began to pass through the tavern, and with each new arrival, the stories surrounding the place grew darker. A man named Jonathan, who had stayed for several days, reported feeling an intense pressure in the air each night, as though invisible eyes were watching him from every corner. The oppressive atmosphere was so thick that he could hardly breathe at times. He spoke to a fellow guest about it, and the other traveler, a woman named Margaret, revealed she had felt the same way. It was as if the very walls of the tavern were alive, observing the guests with an eerie awareness. They both tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the tavern and the brothers who ran it. The nightmares began soon after. Margaret, one of the most outspoken skeptics, had vivid, terrifying dreams every night. In these dreams, she would find herself trapped in dark, oppressive rooms, the walls closing in around her as she tried to escape. She would wake in a cold sweat, only to find herself still lying in the same bed she had fallen asleep in. It was always the same, the sense of being trapped, and yet, no matter how much she tried to move, her body would refuse to respond. At first, she thought it was just the stress of travel, but after a few nights, the nightmares became too vivid to ignore. She shared her experience with a few of the other guests, but they just chalked it up to bad dreams. However, some couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural was at play. One night, a young couple, newly married and on their honeymoon, had a frightening experience that pushed them to the brink of leaving the tavern. After hearing strange noises coming from the cellar in the dead of night, soft footsteps, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, they decided to investigate. But when they tried to leave, they found the front door locked. Despite the fact that it had been wide open when they entered earlier, it was now sealed shut, as though something or someone had barred it from the outside. Panic set in as they tried to break open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Only after a few minutes of frantic struggle did they manage to escape through a back window. When they tried to tell the brothers about their terrifying experience, Elias and Henry only smiled, offering calm reassurances that the door must have simply jammed. It was brushed off as a bad dream, and the couple was made to feel as if they had overreacted. Yet, despite the brothers' insistence that everything was perfectly normal, the rumors continued to spread among the guests. A few of the more persistent and curious travelers began to press the brothers with questions about the tavern's strange history. They wanted to know about the past, about the sudden disappearances, and about the strange occurrences that seemed to plague anyone who stayed for too long. At first, the brothers were charming and evasive, offering cryptic answers that left more questions than answers. When pressed further, Elias would simply smile and change the subject, while Henry would laugh awkwardly and offer them more whiskey. But as the questions continued, their smiles began to grow colder. It was becoming clear that they were hiding something, and the guests were starting to notice. Some guests, unwilling to let the matter drop, began doing their own research. They asked around the village, trying to learn more about the brothers and their tavern. What they uncovered was unsettling, to say the least. Rumors from older villagers hinted that the tavern had been around for much longer than the brothers claimed, and that it had been passed down through generations. There were whispers that the tavern had once been a place of strange gatherings, where people had vanished without a trace. One elderly woman, who had grown up in the village, spoke of a time when the tavern was the site of rituals. Dark rituals that involved the sacrifices of those who ventured too close to its doors. The villagers didn't know if these stories were true, but the growing number of missing persons tied to the tavern made them hard to ignore. As more and more guests began to experience strange phenomena, the atmosphere at the tavern grew heavier. It was no longer just a sense of unease, it was palpable, something that could be felt in the air. The brothers' once charming hospitality had begun to take on an ominous edge. They still smiled and offered their famous whiskey, but their eyes never left the guests for long. It was as if they were studying them, waiting for something. Some guests even claimed to have seen the brothers whispering to each other when they thought no one was watching. The quiet whispers and strange occurrences had built up to a point where no one felt comfortable staying there for long. Still, no one dared to leave, too afraid to admit the truth, that the tavern was no longer just a place of rest. but a trap, and the brothers were the ones who set it. Claire, a local journalist with a penchant for uncovering hidden truths, had been hearing unsettling rumors about the brothers' tavern for weeks. Her curiosity led her to the village, where she checked into the tavern under the guise of a weary traveler in need of rest. However, her true purpose was far more dangerous: to investigate the growing whispers about Elias and Henry. She had heard accounts of strange disappearances, unexplainable events, and a chilling aura surrounding the tavern. As she settled in, Claire made sure to blend in, casually engaging with other guests while keeping her eyes peeled for anything unusual. Yet it wasn't long before she noticed something odd: a locked door at the far end of the tavern, one that neither of the brothers ever seemed to open. Despite the tavern's otherwise cozy atmosphere, something about the door intrigued Claire. It wasn't marked, hidden, or particularly conspicuous, but it was always closed and tightly locked. The brothers never acknowledged it, never mentioned it, and guests rarely even noticed it unless they had been staying for a while. Claire's instincts told her that this room was important, too important to be ignored. Her journalistic instincts kicked in as she became determined to figure out what lay behind that door. Over the next few days, she tried to subtly ask the brothers about it, but they always deflected her questions with polite smiles and vague responses. Henry would claim it was simply a storage room, while Elias remained strangely quiet whenever the subject came up. Her opportunity came one evening when the tavern was less crowded, and one of the brothers, Elias, inadvertently left the door slightly ajar after retrieving something from within. Claire's heart raced as she saw her chance. She approached the door casually, pretending to stretch her legs, and took a quick glance inside. The room was dimly lit, but what she saw made her stomach churn. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood. Symbols that seemed almost too deliberate to be random. Old, dried bloodstains marred the floor in splotches, as if someone had been hurt, or worse, within those walls. There was no mistaking it now. This room was no ordinary storage space. It held a history, one that had been carefully hidden from prying eyes. Inside the room, Claire also noticed an assortment of personal belongings: old clothes, broken trinkets, and other forgotten items. The sight of them made her skin crawl. Some of the belongings were undoubtedly those of previous guests. Claire's mind raced as she began to piece together the disturbing implications. These were the missing travelers. Their things had been carefully preserved, left behind as evidence of their disappearance, as if they had been taken with the intent to never return. The room felt suffocating, a hidden testament to the horrors that had unfolded within the tavern's walls for years. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she pulled herself away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had just uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but it only deepened the mystery and her sense of dread. Claire knew that she couldn't just walk away from what she had seen. Her mind kept racing back to the symbols on the walls and the bloodstains, as if they were calling out for an explanation she wasn't ready to face. The brothers had to know what was inside that room, and they had likely gone to great lengths to ensure that no one discovered it. But now that she had seen it, she was more determined than ever to uncover the full story. She began to conduct her own investigation, speaking with the other guests who had stayed at the tavern. Some of them had noticed oddities too, but none had connected the dots. Claire's curiosity grew with each passing day as she started to piece together the unsettling details of the tavern's history. But as she delved deeper, the brothers began to act more suspiciously toward her. At first, the brothers were cordial as always, but it wasn't long before Claire noticed a subtle shift in their behavior. Elias became distant, his smiles less genuine, while Henry's gaze grew sharper, more intense, whenever she was nearby. It was clear they were beginning to sense her growing interest in the tavern's secrets. They had been careful, up until now, to maintain an air of normalcy, but now Claire could feel the weight of their watchful eyes. The brothers no longer seemed like kind hosts. They seemed like predators, carefully calculating their every move. Claire realized that she had crossed a line, and the brothers knew it. She was no longer a guest in their tavern. She had become a threat. And as her investigation deepened, Claire could feel the tension rising, the suffocating grip of the tavern tightening around her. The truth was within reach, but so was the danger. As Claire dug deeper into the history of the tavern and its owners, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She discovered that the brothers, Elias and Henry, were not just heirs to a small family business. They were part of a dark legacy that had been passed down through generations. Her search led her to a dusty collection of old journals hidden away in a back room of the tavern. The journals belonged to their ancestors, and within their pages Claire found disturbing details about a secretive cult that had once operated in the area. The cult believed in offering travelers as sacrifices to an ancient, malevolent entity in exchange for power, wealth, and immortality. This was no ordinary tavern. It was built as a trap, a place where the brothers could continue the sinister rituals in secret, maintaining the family's dark traditions. The more Claire read, the more she realized that each disappearance was not just a random act of violence or a casualty of fate. Every missing person had been selected, chosen deliberately for their sacrifice to this ancient entity. The tavern, with its cozy atmosphere and welcoming facade, was nothing more than a hunting ground for the brothers. Their hospitality wasn't an act of kindness, but a calculated means to lure in vulnerable travelers who could be used to fuel the ritual. The brothers were well versed in the art of manipulation, always ready with a smile, a drink, and a comforting word to ensnare their victims. Claire's blood ran cold as she began to piece together the terrifying reality of the tavern's true purpose. As the truth began to sink in, Claire realized with growing horror that she had already become part of the brothers' twisted legacy. She wasn't just an outsider investigating an unsolved mystery. She was now part of their ritual, a target to be chosen. The more she thought about it, the more she could see how cleverly she had been drawn into their web. The warm smiles, the endless hospitality, the feeling of being cared for, it had all been a trap. The brothers had been studying her, waiting for the right moment to make her their next victim. Claire could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the terror of her situation became impossible to ignore. She was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no easy escape. Desperate to free herself from the grip of the brothers, Claire began to plan her escape. She tried to leave in the dead of night, hoping to slip away unnoticed, but it quickly became clear that the brothers knew her every move. No matter how subtle her attempts to flee, Elias and Henry were always there, standing in her path, watching her with their cold, calculating eyes. The tavern, with its dark secrets and hidden corridors, seemed to close in around her at every turn. The brothers were always a step ahead, as if they anticipated her every action. Claire's desperation mounted as she realized that there was no escape from the sinister grasp of the tavern, and every corner she turned seemed to bring her closer to the darkness she had uncovered. With each passing hour, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Claire understood that she was running out of time. The brothers had been planning this for years, carefully selecting their victims, continuing the blood rituals that had begun long before her arrival. The hospitality that had once seemed so genuine now felt like a hollow pretense, designed to conceal the true horror of the brothers' intentions. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the heavy pressure of their anticipation building as they prepared for the night when she would be chosen. Claire knew that in their twisted world there was no room for her to simply walk away. She was caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking up. In her final moments of freedom, Claire made one last, desperate attempt to escape. She raced through the dark halls of the tavern, her heart pounding as the footsteps of Elias and Henry echoed behind her. But the tavern seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with a suffocating presence. It was as if the building itself was alive, complicit in the brothers' plan. Claire stumbled into the main room, where the fire burned bright, casting long shadows on the walls. But the brothers were there, waiting. There was no way out. As she stood there cornered, she realized the horrifying truth. The tavern was never meant to offer rest. It was a place to trap, to feed, and to keep the dark legacy of the brothers alive for another generation. And now, she was about to become part of that legacy. As Claire raced through the dimly lit hallways of the tavern, her heart pounding in her chest, she thought she might actually make it out. The door to the back exit was within reach, but just as she reached for the handle, she was seized from behind by Elias. His grip was like iron, and before she could react, Henry appeared from the shadows, blocking her escape. The brothers' faces, once so kind and welcoming, now twisted into something far darker, more sinister. Elias looked her dead in the eye, his voice cold and calculating as he explained the horrifying truth. Claire wasn't just another guest. She was the final piece of their twisted ritual, the last offering needed to secure their family's continued prosperity. The horror of his words hit Claire like a punch to the stomach, and the weight of the situation began to sink in. The brothers revealed that every traveler who had come to their tavern was never just a guest. They were selected for a purpose. Each person who disappeared had been part of a blood sacrifice to an ancient entity, one that had been feeding off the lives of their victims for generations. The success of the tavern, its endless stream of guests, and the brothers' unearthly ability to remain untouched by time and misfortune were all tied to these dark offerings. Elias and Henry were merely the keepers of a ritual older than the village itself. Claire, with her relentless curiosity, had unknowingly stepped into their trap. She was to be the last in a long line of sacrifices, and her life would seal the fate of their family's power for another generation. With terrifying precision, the brothers led Claire into a hidden chamber deep beneath the tavern. It was an altar, an abominable shrine filled with the remains of the victims who had come before her. Old, rotting bones were piled in the corners, and the walls were covered in grotesque symbols, each one a marker of a soul taken. In the center of the room stood a stone slab, worn smooth from centuries of use. This was where the ritual would be completed, and Claire would take her place as the final offering. She fought against the mounting panic, her mind racing for a way to escape. But the brothers were prepared. The ritual had already begun, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and dark magic. As Elias and Henry began chanting in a language Claire didn't understand, she felt the atmosphere shift. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in on her. The brothers moved around her with eerie precision, their hands tracing the ancient symbols on the altar, preparing for the final act. Claire's body felt weak, her mind clouded by the oppressive energy in the room. It was as if an invisible force was binding her, making her unable to move or break free. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for anything that could help her, but the ritual was unfolding too quickly. She could feel the cold grip of the brothers' magic seeping into her very soul. But Claire wasn't ready to give in. With every ounce of strength left in her, she fought against the power that seemed to hold her in place. Her thoughts were racing. If she could break the brothers' concentration, if she could disrupt the ritual somehow, maybe she could escape. She lunged forward, pushing against the force that bound her, but the brothers were ready for her resistance. Elias stepped forward, his hand raised as if to silence her struggle. His voice was low, commanding, as he spoke the final words of the incantation. Claire's heart raced, but she refused to submit. She knew that if she didn't act now, it would be too late. Suddenly, a burst of adrenaline surged through her, and Claire pushed herself off the stone slab, breaking free of the invisible chains that had been holding her. She knew this was her only chance, her one shot to escape the horrors that awaited her. In a desperate move, she grabbed a nearby shard of broken wood, the remnants of one of the old furniture pieces scattered around the altar. She aimed it at Elias, hoping to disrupt the ritual and catch the brothers off guard. But as she swung the shard toward him, the room seemed to shake violently, and the chanting from the brothers grew louder, more insistent. The air was thick with power, and Claire could feel it closing in on her, suffocating her with every passing second. As the ritual reached its climax, Claire realized that her only chance of survival was to destroy the source of the brothers' power, the ancient magic that had bound them to their dark legacy for so long. She needed to sever their connection to the entity they had been serving for centuries. But time was running out, and the brothers were too strong. With one final desperate cry, Claire lunged at the altar, hoping to break the magic before it consumed her completely. The brothers' sinister smiles only grew wider, knowing that the power they had fought so long to maintain was about to claim another soul. In a moment of sheer willpower, Claire tore herself from the altar and sprinted out of the ritual chamber, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. She had no time to waste. She needed to stop the brothers before it was too late. The ancient knowledge she had uncovered during her investigation had given her one glimmer of hope, the symbol that held their power. She knew that if she could destroy it, she would break the curse that had bound Elias and Henry to the dark forces that had sustained them for generations. Her mind raced as she thought about the ritual, the symbols she had seen etched into the walls, and the final crucial piece of the puzzle. With no time to lose, she reached for a shard of broken stone and began frantically scratching at the symbol that had been drawn on the floor of the chamber. As she destroyed the symbol, the room seemed to tremble. The air grew heavy, and an ominous rumble echoed through the tavern. It was as if the very foundations of the building were being shaken by the collapse of the ritual's power. The brothers had relied on this curse for centuries, using it to maintain their immortality and wealth, but as Claire broke the symbol, their connection to the dark force they had worshipped was severed. Elias and Henry's faces contorted in shock and fury as they realized their grip on the entity had slipped away. They had no more power, no more strength to carry out their twisted rituals. The years of blood sacrifices, the endless manipulation of guests, had finally come to an end. But in the moments that followed, the brothers did not succumb to despair. Instead, they became frantic, their once calm demeanor shattered. Elias and Henry's eyes burned with rage as they lunged at Claire, desperate to restore what they had lost. The tavern, now a crumbling shell of its former self, seemed to respond to the brothers' madness. The walls shook as if the building itself were fighting against the destruction of its dark legacy. Claire knew that her survival depended on defeating the brothers once and for all, but the stakes had never been higher. Her only chance was to fight back and destroy the very source of their power. But the brothers were relentless, their rage blinding them to the consequences of their actions. A brutal confrontation ensued, with Claire using everything she had learned to defend herself. She dodged their attacks, her mind focused on the one goal: survival. Elias and Henry, once so calculated and composed, were now wild and reckless. The brothers, unhinged by the loss of their power, fought with a desperation Claire had never seen before. The tavern seemed to come alive with their fury, as if the very building was feeding off their violent emotions. Claire, though outnumbered, used her wits and the tools she had found in her investigation to turn the tide. She struck when they least expected it, catching them off guard in the chaos of the moment. With each blow, she weakened them, but the cost of the fight was high. The tavern groaned and shuddered as the supernatural forces tied to the brothers' rituals began to unravel. Despite the brothers' frantic efforts to overpower her, Claire finally gained the upper hand. With one final decisive strike, she sent them both crashing to the floor, their bodies lifeless and broken. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, and the oppressive weight of the tavern's dark magic lifted. But as the brothers fell, the building itself began to collapse. The very walls that had once held the brothers' twisted legacy now began to crumble around her. The floors shook violently and the ceiling cracked, sending debris falling in all directions. Claire had broken the curse, but in doing so, she had set the tavern's dark forces in motion, and there was no escaping the destruction that followed. As Claire stumbled out of the crumbling tavern, she looked back one last time. The structure that had been the source of so much suffering was now nothing more than a ruin, consumed by its own darkness. The fire that had once burned so brightly in the hearth was now nothing more than a dying ember. The place that had once been the brothers' domain was now a hollow shell, empty and abandoned. Claire was free, but the cost had been immense. She had destroyed the curse, ended the brothers' reign, but the dark legacy of the tavern would never truly be erased. As the building collapsed into the earth, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something of the brothers' evil had survived, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close.